My name is Sophia, and this is my story. I am 38 years old and have been married to Marco for 12 years. When we met, everything seemed perfect. We were two soulmates who had found their place in the world, linked by common dreams and a complicity that seemed indestructible. Our years of engagement were a magical time, full of small romantic gestures and plans for the future. After a few years, we decided to get married, fulfilling a dream that seemed written in destiny. Marco has always been a thoughtful, attentive, and present man, the type of husband that many women dream of. He was the man who made me feel protected and loved, with his dedication and his unique way of making me laugh even in difficult moments. However, in recent years, something has changed. His work, which we once considered an opportunity to build our future, has ended up absorbing all his energy, leaving him distant and distracted. Our conversations were reduced to simple casual phrases, and I began to feel alone, neglected, almost invisible, as if I were a detail in his hectic life. We live in a large, welcoming house, built with the help of his father, Antonio, a house that once represented our refuge but now often seems too big and empty, reflecting the sense of loneliness that has crept into my life. Each room is full of memories of the happy moments we lived together, but now those images seem faded, clouded by a routine that has taken over. Giovanni is a charming and charismatic man in his 50s, with an energy that many younger men envy him. After his wife's death, he decided to move into the annex of our house, a choice that initially seemed convenient to me. He would have had his only son close by, and we would have had extra help with the housework. After all, Giovanni has always been like a second father to me, at least until I started to notice certain looks, certain enigmatic smiles, and that way of behaving that seemed to go beyond simple affection. Our days followed one another peacefully, until Giovanni began to be more and more part of my daily life. Marco, with his increasingly frequent business trips, didn't seem to notice how much time I spent with his father, chatting in the garden or drinking a coffee in the kitchen, which suddenly seemed too intimate and cramped. My mother-in-law, before she died, had warned me several times to be careful of Giovanni, saying that he had a hidden side that few people knew about. At the time, I hadn't given any weight to those words, attributing them to the jealousy of a woman who didn't want to see her husband tied up with another woman. But now I was starting to wonder if she had been right. Giovanni was capable of being extremely kind, and at the same time throwing out biting comments, almost as if he was testing my limits. And I, for some reason, instead of walking away, found those subtle challenges more and more intriguing. Marco, on the other hand, seemed to become more distant every day, lost in his plans and commitments. He often came home too tired to talk, and our moments of intimacy were reduced to simple routine gestures, devoid of the passion that once united us. I felt like a spectator in my own life, and, somehow, Giovanni's charisma attracted me, as if it were a lifeline in a sea of monotony. I tried to keep everything in balance: the marriage, the housework, the relationship with Giovanni, and above all that mask of tranquility that I wore every day to prevent my life from exploding. But inside me, doubts and temptations grew, fueled by those subtle whispers and those ambiguous looks. I was no longer sure of anything, and the tension between me and Giovanni became more palpable every day. Have you ever experienced a moment when your feelings faced you with a difficult choice? Tell me about it in the comments. Lately, the days had turned into a sort of dangerous game, like walking on a tightrope, trying to maintain balance without ever losing control. Giovanni had started to spend more and more time at home, sometimes with banal excuses. I have to fix a tap, or I was just stopping by to check. Every time he stopped for a coffee or to chat, the distance between us seemed to grow shorter. Initially, I told myself that it was just my idea, an impression due to my loneliness. But his words, apparently harmless, always had a double meaning, a subtle nuance that made me shiver. When Marco wasn't there, Giovanni was more relaxed, with an almost complicit attitude. I began to notice small details that had always escaped me. His hand, that lingered on my shoulder for a second too long, that faint smile when he found me alone in the kitchen, or his gaze that followed me every time I left the room. One afternoon, while Marco was away on one of his usual trips, Giovanni showed up at my door with a bottle of red wine, saying he wanted to celebrate his son's career success. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher, and, strangely enough, I agreed. We sat in the living room. The sunset light filtered through the curtains, coloring the room a warm orange. We talked for a long time, and I discovered that Giovanni was a much more complex man than I had imagined. He told me about his youth, about unrealized dreams and hidden regrets, and I found myself confessing more to him than I had ever told my husband. His presence was hypnotic, and even though I knew I was walking on slippery ground, I couldn't stop. That evening we found ourselves sitting too close together, and for a moment I felt his breath brush my neck. I looked away, trying to stay calm, but the air felt electric, filled with tension that grew with each passing minute. When he got up to go, I noticed his hand lightly touching mine, and that gesture, even if fleeting, made me hold my breath. After that evening, our meetings became more frequent. Every occasion was a good one to exchange a few words, an ambiguous smile, or a glance that lasted a moment too long. Giovanni seemed to enjoy challenging my self-control, testing me with jokes that could be interpreted in different ways, and I, instead of rejecting him, participated in the game, responding with the same ambiguity, as if a part of me wanted to see how far we could go before exceeding a limit that could no longer be ignored. One day, while I was tidying up the guest bathroom, a slight creak behind me made me turn around abruptly. The door had opened silently, and Antonio was there, on the threshold, with a look that betrayed an unusual intensity. There was no trace of his usual affable smile. In its place, a serious, almost indecipherable expression. "Do you need help?" he asked in a calm voice. But without waiting for an answer, he crossed the threshold and closed the door behind him with a measured gesture. In that instant, time seemed to slow, every sound fading to a distant murmur. My heart began to beat with a force that seemed to shake my entire being, and yet no matter how much my mind begged me to react, my body remained still. "Sophia," he said finally, in a low tone, almost a whisper, "you are so much more than Marco could ever deserve." Those words fell on me like a sudden shock, shattering the silence with cruel precision. I tried to respond, to say something that would break the spell that had been created, but the words remained choked in my throat. He approached. Each step seemed calculated to reduce the physical distance that was becoming more and more unbearable. When he was in front of me, I could feel the heat of his body, the subtle scent he gave off, and yet nothing happened. Antonio did nothing but stare into my eyes, a deep and penetrating gaze that seemed to delve into the most hidden recesses of my soul. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me there, trembling, confused, with my heart beating like a crazy drum. From that moment, every meeting with Antonio became an intricate game of masks and subtle ambiguities. In front of Marco, we both wore the robe of affectionate and composed family members. But when we were alone, The air was charged with a palpable energy, an invisible thread of tension that bound us, pulling us ever closer to a breaking point. It was like walking on a thin tightrope over an abyss, with the knowledge that a single false step could break that precarious balance. Every gesture, every look, seemed full of hidden meanings. When Marco, unaware of everything, spent his evenings at work or busy with his endless travels, I found myself spending hours in Antonio's company. One day, during one of these absences, I decided to organize a family dinner, a desperate attempt to re-establish some semblance of normality. Antonio helped me in the kitchen, and while I was cutting vegetables, I felt his gaze on me. When I looked up, I found him a few centimeters away. He didn't touch me, he didn't say anything, but his closeness was enough to make me tremble. "Be careful, Sophia," he said finally, with that ambiguous smile that seemed to hide 1,000 meanings. "You can hurt yourself with blades." His words echoed in my mind all evening, a warning that seemed to carry with it a hint of foreboding. That evening after dinner, Marco retreated to his study for a work call, leaving me alone with Antonio. I tried to maintain a light tone, a semblance of tranquility, but the atmosphere had become dense, almost oppressive. Antonio took out an old family photo album and invited me to look through it with him. I accepted, trying to mask my growing anxiety, but when I saw the images of Marco as a child with his mother, a wave of guilt overwhelmed me. Antonio, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, telling me anecdotes from his youth with a disarming ease. I found myself laughing, relaxing next to him, as if that moment were truly innocent. Yet as he spoke, telling me how empty his life had become after his wife's death, and how I had been an unexpectedly important presence, I felt my resistance crumble, one fragment at a time. The climax came a few days later, during a sultry summer afternoon. Marco was out of town, and I took care of the usual household chores. While I was mopping the bathroom floor, the door opened ajar. Looking up, I saw Antonio in the doorway, with an expression I couldn't decipher. "I forgot my wrench," he said, pointing to a shelf above the sink. I moved to let him pass, trying to maintain an appearance of calm, but the room suddenly seemed too small, too hot. When his arm accidentally brushed against me, my breath hitched. Antonio didn't move immediately, leaving me suspended in that tense moment. "You know, Sophia," he finally murmured, in a tone that made me shiver. "Sometimes I feel like you're afraid of me, but you shouldn't." Those words dug a chasm of doubts and desires inside me, leaving me with a pounding heart and a disturbing certainty nothing would ever be the same again. Our gazes met more and more often, intertwining in a silent dialogue that burned with unspoken promises. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt the world stop for a moment. That spark, that thrill, left me breathless, unable to hide the turmoil inside me. In the evening, when Marco returned home, I wore the mask of normality, but my mind was far away, caught in a vortex of emotions that overwhelmed me, oscillating between a sense of guilt and that irresistible attraction for Giovanni. He seemed to understand it, as if he could read every nuance of my soul. He played with my nerves, with my desire, pushing me towards the limit, as if we were protagonists of a secret game, a forbidden ritual known only to us. The breaking moment came on a night full of rain and restlessness. Marco had suddenly left for work, leaving the house shrouded in a heavy, almost oppressive silence. When Giovanni knocked on the door, the sound seemed to break that deafening void. It had a banal pretext, a favor, but in reality it was just one more step towards the inevitable. We found ourselves in the kitchen, immersed in a conversation that seemed to go on forever. His gaze followed my every movement, and when I got up to go to bed, I felt him still on me, silent but filled with an intensity that made me tremble. A few days later, the summer heat filled the house with an electric, tense, and vibrant energy. Marco had been gone for days, and I felt lost in that solitude. The ticking of the clock seemed to mark not only time, but also the irregular beats of my heart. Giovanni called me with his usual confident voice, offering to come by to fix a leak in the bathroom. It was just an excuse, I knew, but I accepted without hesitation, longing for his presence. When he rang at the door, I welcomed him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. His smile had a hidden complicity, a tacit agreement that vibrated between us. If the story is engaging you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next emotions. Your every gesture is a great support for us. As I followed him towards the bathroom, each step seemed marked by an invisible rhythm, a crescendo of tension. I watched him as he leaned under the sink, his movements slow and studied, and I leaned against the door, trying to mask the agitation that consumed me. Every gesture, every sound seemed amplified, creating an atmosphere suspended in time. When he stood up, our bodies were so close that I could feel his breath brushing my skin. "Sophia," he whispered in that deep voice that seemed to penetrate my every defense. "What are we doing?" His tone was a mixture of desire and torment. I found no words, only the silence that enveloped us, full of meaning. His hand rested delicately on mine, offering me an escape route that I didn't take. I stood still, heart pounding, as the warmth of his touch radiated through me. Our lips met in a kiss that was both delicate and fierce, an explosion of repressed emotions and unexpressed desires. If you want to receive new videos of the series, write "I want the sequel" in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to receive a preview of future publications. Thank you.